Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. There's been this video where the African leaders were meeting some of their leaders in the developed countries, the conference, and they've spoken boldly to them. Let's just listen to this one. And this is focusing on the issue of is Africa beggars or should they be treated as equal? Just listen to this one.
But there have been times when we felt like we were beggars. I played a key role as chair of the African Union during the COVID period. We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the Northern Hemisphere countries had bought all the vaccines in the world, and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And we felt like we were begging. And at times it felt like they would just be droppings from the table, that yes, we will give you that and that. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment. We resented that, and it got worse when we said we want to manufacture our own vaccines. And when we went to the WTO, there was a lot of resistance, enormous resistance. And we kept saying, what is more important, life or profits by your big pharmaceutical companies? And that too, I must tell you now, generated and deepened that disappointment and resentment on our part, because we felt like life in the Northern Hemisphere is much more important than life in the global South. And these are issues that need to be addressed. And I'm glad that we are all seated here like this, because we've got to get to the heart of these matters and address them. Now, I come to promises that have been made. And Chancellor Scholz was saying, we've got to walk the talk. Yes, we want to see the talk being walked. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday said at the dinner, $100 billion was promised per year. And he was saying, I've never seen that. And many of us will testify that that $100 billion has never really been made available. And this...
I would stop there. This is an interesting debate, but which we in Africa have got to take very seriously. The issue of whether Africa was begging or not, I think we can quickly dismiss this. Well, when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines, Africa was begging. Africa was not offering to buy the vaccines. They were just begging for the vaccines. That is the economic reality. When the various pharmaceutical companies were developing their various vaccines, what the developed countries did was to invest in that commitment upfront. Very few African countries did that. And as the various vaccines came online, yes, the bidding started in earnest. Very few countries, African countries, did that. And so Africa was going around with a begging bowl. I think it's laughable. If you've got a begging bowl and they are begging, and then you want to insist that you're not a beggar, you are a beggar. What makes Africa's position even worse, and this I'll focus on the case of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, even at that time, we knew that the country was losing a staggering $1.6 billion per year to gold smuggling. If we add to that the money that was being lost through the looting of diamonds, lithium, and other resources, the amount is unbelievable. So a country like Zimbabwe had the resources to buy the vaccines. It's just that, as usual, we had our priorities all upside down. Even when we got some of the vaccines, when they were donated, or the equipment, we all know that the ruling elite saw that as another golden opportunity to loot. The former Minister of Health, Obadiah Moyo, lost his job because Hopewell Chinono revealed that he had been involved in the looting of a staggering 60 million US dollars in drugs and some equipment and so forth. The World Bank and IMF facilitated the donation of some of those vaccine equipment and drugs during the COVID. And it is on public record that some of that money was not properly accounted for. Africa has a problem of failing to allocate its resources and use its resources wisely. This is a fundamental problem. Africa is one of the richest continents in the world, and yet we are the poorest, not because we don't have the resources. It's because we fail to use our resources properly. This is at the heart of our problem. And as for giving the international community, the West in particular, a lecture on how they should use their resources, I think this one we've got to go back to Adam Smith. He is a Scottish economist and philosopher whose work has been the foundation of many of economics in the world. And in it, he argued, in one of his works, he argued that we should not look to the benevolence of the butcher and the brewer and the baker for our meal, for our dinner, but to their saving self-interest. That is what capitalism is all about. The butcher is not interested in saving you from starvation, nor the baker, nor the brewer, serving you beer because you need a beer. He will make the beer because he wants to make profit. And for us to try to change the rules now and pretend we can somehow force the pharmaceutical companies to give up the idea of making profit and all be philanthropists, work for the good of humanity, particularly in a continent that can afford these things, to pay for these things, if we use our resources properly. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, whether we like it or not. Even President Ramaphosa himself, South Africa, for instance, is not going to be, even if it is, for instance, in the southern African region, it is the economic powerhouse. But it's not going to start saying, well, because we are economically richer than the rest of the SADC region, from now on, we, for the good of Southern Africa, will be giving Zimbabwe so many tons of maize and wheat, and Swaziland so many tons of oil or medicine or whatever it is, without having those countries having to pay for those things. If it was to do that, for how long will those South African suppliers last? Or would the government be paying the farmers so that the maize can be sent to Zimbabwe for free, Zambia for free? Particularly the issue of food. Zimbabwe, ever since the violent farm seizures that started in 2000, every 2 or 3 years, Zimbabwe has had to rely on food aid. This was a country that was the grain supplier of grain, of food, the bread basket of the region. But all that was lost because Robert Mugabe decided to seize the farms and give them to party loyalists for the bigger part. And so was South Africa going to step in and say, well, we can't let the Zimbabweans starve. From now on, we'll supply you with grain, and you don't have to pay for it because life is more important than profit. If they did that, the question is, how long was that going to last? Is that a realistic solution? The answer is no. So to paraphrase Adam Smith, one can say Africa should not be looking to the developed Northern Hemisphere or their pharmaceutical companies to supply Africa with all its medical needs. Africa has got to develop and make the best of its resources and be able to produce some of these things itself. And what it cannot produce, to buy them on the open market and not have to rely on handouts. You cannot go around with a begging bowl, begging, and then out of misplaced ego, claim that you're not a beggar. That is laughable. You have got the begging bowl. You are begging, and you claim you're not a beggar. We want to be treated as equal. If you're going to be treated as equal, then you must compete as an equal. I think Africa has got to stop this culture, this victim mentality. It's disappointing that our African leaders have not sat down among themselves and saying, let's put Africa's house in order. Let's stop the waste of the continent's material and human resources. Africa has got so much potential, but it's being wasted. That is the problem with Africa. We are not going to solve it by pretending and by teaming up with the rest of our African friends and demanding that we want to be treated as equal. In that video, President Cyril Ramaphosa went on to talk about how African leaders want to be treated as equal in financial institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and so forth. How much is African countries contributing to those financial institutions? And how much have they been borrowing and then failing to pay it back? We have got to put our own house in order. We have got to build sound economic economies, well managed, competently managed. And then we will not need to go around begging. Earlier in that video, President Cyril Ramaphosa was talking about how a team of African leaders went to Ukraine and then went on to Russia to ask those two countries to sit down and resolve their differences as regards the ongoing war between those two countries, because he claimed that the war is causing serious economic hardships in Africa and causing serious shortages of grain and fertilizers that we import from those countries. It's true. But why is it that Africa, with everything else they have, they're totally relying on countries like Ukraine and Russia for grain? As I said earlier on, Zimbabwe used to be the bread basket of the Southern African region. Why has President Cyril Ramaphosa sat down and said, what happened to Zimbabwe? We would not have to import grain from all the way from Russia or Ukraine and pay for the cost of transport and so forth. If one of our own countries across the border is producing all that grain, it will be even cheaper for South Africans to import it from Zimbabwe, assuming that South African farmers themselves could not produce enough to feed the South Africans. Even in a year when you've had a bad year, why do we have to import grain from Southern Africa, from South America, Europe, North America, and so forth, to feed countries in Africa? Why is it that we failed to stock up on a good year? Zimbabwe has been failing, like I said, to produce enough food. Every 2 or 3 years, we've relied on food aid. And some of it won't even be able to pay for it. Not because we don't have the money, because Zimbabwe's wealth is being squandered by the filthy rich ruling elite at the expense of the ordinary. That is the problem that we want Africa to address. That is the problem that we want our friend across the Limpopo to address. Zimbabwe's main problem is home made. We are failing to govern ourselves in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a failed state because of bad governance. We are right now in the middle of an election. And everything is already clear. ZANU-PF is rigging these elections, just as it has rigged elections in the past. And President Cyril Ramaphosa and his ANC friends at their Congress in November have decided that Zimbabwe's economic problems are caused by sanctions. And they've refused to accept what it is not sanctions at all, but rather gross mismanagement and corruption. They've refused to accept that. They focused it on sanctions. And so they've already decided that Zimbabwe elections, which are the voting is on the 23rd of August, whatever the outcome, ANC is not going to allow regime change in Zimbabwe because there are sanctions. As far as they are concerned, the sanctions are designed to force the people to reject ZANU-PF and have regime change. The funny part of it is the economy was already in trouble long before the sanctions were imposed. Zimbabwe had the Economic Structural Adjustment Program in 1990 to 1995, which was an acknowledgement that the economy was in trouble. That program was supposed to revive the economy. It did not. And so Zimbabwe went back to the World Bank and the IMF and got another 5-year economic structural adjustment program, in which those financial institutions provided the loans to pay for the adjustments. But again, at the end of the 5-year period, the economy had not revived. It was then that the IMF and the World Bank stopped giving Zimbabwe any loans and any financial assistance. And most of the other Western-backed financial institutions like the Paris Club also stopped giving Zimbabwe financial assistance. So Zimbabwe's economy was already in deep trouble then. And the sanctions were imposed in 2001. So to argue that the sanctions are the ones that are causing Zimbabwe's economic problems is totally unfounded. South Africa has got its own agenda in the Zimbabwe elections. And that is the truth. President Cyril Ramaphosa knows that South Africa's economy is in serious trouble. South Africa's economy has not reached the same level as Zimbabwe, but it is going in that direction. South Africa is becoming a failed state, just another failed state out of the many African countries that are a failed state. And Zimbabwe has become the stereotype failed state that the whole world is laughing at. And I think South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his friends in the ANC, when they met, they realized that if they are not going to turn around the economy in the next 12 months, because South Africa is facing elections next year, ANC may be put out of office. And events in Zimbabwe will count a lot for South Africa. Because if, for the sake of argument, elections were free, fair, and credible in Zimbabwe, and the people of Zimbabwe were to boot out ZANU-PF at long last, and the economy of Zimbabwe was to start improving, this is not a far cry. The 2008 to 2013 government of national unity, one of the things that happened was that the Zimbabwe economy did improve. In 2008, the Zimbabwe economy shrunk by 6%. In 2009, a year after the GNU, the economy grew by a staggering 12%. That kind of improvement, if that was to happen again, and let's face it, it can easily happen, because the Zimbabwe economy hasn't reached the same level of chaotic state that it was in 2008, but it's definitely moving towards it. So that significant improvement is not cannot be ruled out if there was meaningful change in Zimbabwe after the 23rd of August elections. If South Africans were to see those changes, I would argue that they would only be encouraged to try to have regime change in their own country as well, just to save the country from further drifting into these dangerous waters of a failed state. No one can deny that South Africa is drifting towards that. Corruption has been rampant in South Africa. When it's got to talk of President Zuma and the Indian brothers and their state capture, the recent Zero documentary, Gold Mafia, mostly focusing on Zimbabwe, did have sections showing South Africans who were involved. So the Gold Mafia corruption also included South Africans in the looting, the gold smuggling, or the laundering of the money. Most South Africans, even as I speak right now, are sitting in the dark because South Africa has had serious load shedding. Even their big wealth generating industries and mines, and even some of the essential services like hospitals, have not been spared the load shedding. It is widely believed that the South African economy, because of the load shedding, will shrink this year by 2%. Unemployment in South Africa is already very high, and it will only get worse as the economy shrinks. So again, we are finding ourselves in a situation where we're saying these are problems, these are internal problems, these problems should be sorted out. And yet, instead of sorting them out, our African leaders are teaming up and want to rewrite economic theory. They want economists to abandon this notion that Adam Smith established, that the baker is not going to supply bread out of generosity, benevolence of the baker. Bake day in, day out bread to supply the whole neighborhood out of the generosity. That's not going to happen. He needs to buy the wheat from the farmer. The farmer isn't going to farm to supply the wheat just out of generosity either. We need to run our economies in a more rational way. We need to stop this criminal waste of resources in Africa. We need to stop this culture of forever blaming the West for our own failures. The West is not going to solve our problems out of charity. The donations that they are giving will never make African countries prosperous. If we want Africa to prosper, we have got to stop the criminal waste of our country's resources through gross mismanagement and corruption. And one sure way of making sure that there is meaningful competition and there's quality leadership is making sure that we have got free, fair, and credible elections. And it is an outrage when a country like South Africa, definitely the superpower in our region, is ignoring the fact that ZANU-PF has never held free, fair, and credible elections ever since the country's independence in 1980. So it's 43 years and counting. ZANU-PF has rigged elections. And yet they want to turn a blind eye to all that and pretend that elections that have been rigged are free, fair, and credible, and thus give ZANU-PF legitimacy. This is the reality that we have got to solve in Africa. This is the challenge that we've got to solve in Africa. We don't want to be beggars. But for God's sake, if we've got a begging bowl and they are begging, you're a beggar. Thank you and good night.